On the morning of December 8, 1941, just hours after Japanese planes left Pearl Harbor in flames, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo wrote a private memo. He didn't write of glory or conquest, he wrote of relief. "I feel at ease," the note reads. "The anxiety of the past months has been cleared away." For Tojo, this was not a mad gamble. It was the successful execution of a precise, cold-blooded calculation designed to secure Japan's future. For 6 months, this plan would seem brilliant. Then, it would lead his nation to absolute ruin. This raises the central question: how could a strategy that began with such flawless execution prove so catastrophically wrong? This is the story of that calculation, a plan born from months of bitter debate inside Japan's Imperial conferences. It was built on critical assumptions about America's will to fight, and on fatal blind spots in Japan's own war machine. To understand the logic of the attack is to understand the trap closing around the Japanese Empire in the fall of 1941. That trap had been tightening for years, but by the autumn of 1941, it had snapped shut. Japan's war in China, raging since 1937, had devolved into a vast, bloody quagmire, consuming men, material, and fuel with no end in sight. Then, on July 26, 1941, Washington turned off the spigot. In response to Japan's occupation of French Indochina, the United States froze all Japanese assets and enacted a total embargo on oil. Over 80% of Japan's oil came from America. Overnight, its war machine was put on a timer. The Imperial Navy's own estimates were grim. Less than 2 years of fuel reserves remained. The choice presented at the tense Imperial conferences in Tokyo was brutal. Option A: capitulate. Accept American demands to withdraw completely from China. This meant abandoning a decade of conquest and suffering a national humiliation from which the military government might never recover. Option B: fight. Seize the oil-rich Dutch East Indies by force. This would secure Japan's resources, but it was a direct path to war with the United States. The debate was bitter. The Imperial Army, desperate for the resources to break the stalemate in China, pushed aggressively for the southern invasion, but the Imperial Navy was deeply hesitant. Its commander, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was acutely aware of the enemy he would have to face. He and his staff knew Japan could not win a protracted war against America's colossal industrial might. Yet, as diplomacy with Washington stalled and the oil reserves dwindled with each passing week, the hardliners' argument grew stronger. War was no longer a choice. It felt like the only option left. The decision was made. But a direct invasion of Southeast Asia was suicide, as long as the U.S. Pacific Fleet, recently moved to Pearl Harbor, could strike their flank and sever their vital supply lines. That fleet had to be removed from the board. On November 26, 1941, the most powerful carrier strike force the world had yet seen slipped out of a remote bay in northern Japan. Under Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, 6 aircraft carriers and their escorts sailed into the harsh North Pacific under absolute radio silence. For over 10 days, the fate of the empire hung by a thread. A single patrol plane, a stray merchant ship, discovery meant catastrophic failure, the war lost before it had even begun. The objective was not simply to sink battleships. The true goal, born from those desperate debates in Tokyo, was to deliver a psychological shock so profound it would shatter America's will to fight. The calculation was that a nation they viewed as materialistic and soft would sue for a negotiated peace rather than endure a long, bloody war. Then, on the morning of December 7th, the gamble appeared to pay off beyond all expectations. Reports flooded back to Imperial headquarters, battleships burning, airfields destroyed. The first critical phase of the plan had been executed with stunning precision. The anxiety that had gripped the leadership vanished, replaced by a wave of national euphoria. The path to securing Japan's empire now seemed wide open, and for the next 180 days, that path would be paved with a series of victories so swift, so total, they seemed to confirm every part of Tojo's calculation. The first shockwave hit just 3 days after Pearl Harbor. On December 10, 1941, off the coast of Malaya, Japanese naval bombers found the pride of the British Royal Navy, the state-of-the-art battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. Sailing without air cover, a fatal miscalculation by their commander, the 2 capital ships were swarmed. Within 2 hours, both were at the bottom of the South China Sea. In a single action, Japan had proven a revolutionary doctrine. The age of the battleship was over. The age of naval air power, a power they had perfected, had arrived. In London, Winston Churchill would later write, "In all the war, I never received a more direct shock." The momentum was unstoppable. In February 1942, the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, fell. The cornerstone of British power in Asia was designed to repel an attack from the sea. Its massive guns pointed uselessly outward as General Tomoyuki Yamashita's forces did the unthinkable, invading by land down the impassable Malayan Peninsula. The surrender of 80,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops was the largest capitulation in British military history. The myth of European military superiority in Asia was shattered in a single week. With Allied naval and land power broken, the grand strategic prize was finally secured. Japanese forces swept through the Philippines and, most importantly, seized the Dutch East Indies. By March 1942, the vast oil fields of Borneo and Sumatra were under their control. The timer that had been counting down on Japan's war machine was reset. The planned defensive perimeter was now a reality, a massive shield stretching thousands of miles across the Pacific. From Tokyo's perspective, the primary war aim had been achieved with breathtaking speed and efficiency. The hardest part was over. Now, all they had to do was defend it. But in Washington, the most critical assumption in Japan's entire strategy was already proving dead wrong. The shock of Pearl Harbor did not produce calls for negotiation. It produced a unifying national rage. On December 8th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before Congress and declared the previous day a date which will live in infamy. The call was not for a settlement, but for absolute victory. America's industrial might, the sleeping giant Admiral Yamamoto had feared, began to stir. Roosevelt called for the production of 60,000 aircraft in 1942 alone, more than the entire Japanese air fleet. Auto plants in Detroit began retooling to build bombers. Shipyards started operating 24 hours a day. The Japanese calculation had banked on a soft, divided America. The reality was a determined nation mobilizing for total war on a scale the world had never seen. Then, on April 18, 1942, the war came home to Japan. 16 American B-25 bombers, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, appeared in the skies over Tokyo. Launched from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet in a daring one-way mission, the raid inflicted minimal physical damage. But its psychological impact was immense. The sacred homeland, the emperor's capital itself, had been bombed. The public was stunned. The military leadership was deeply humiliated. The Imperial Navy had failed its most fundamental duty, to protect Japan from attack. The Doolittle Raid proved that the defensive perimeter, for all its vastness, was not impenetrable. It was a direct challenge to the entire strategy. For Admiral Yamamoto, this was the final proof. The American carriers that had escaped Pearl Harbor, the very ones that had just launched bombers against Tokyo, remained a mortal threat. The perimeter would never be secure as long as they roamed the Pacific. They had to be found and destroyed in one final, decisive battle. A plan was set in motion to lure the American fleet into a trap at a tiny atoll in the middle of the ocean, Midway. But the brilliant military success concealed a fatal strategic flaw. It was not tactical or technological, it was political. The entire Japanese plan rested on one core assumption, that a series of short, shocking defeats would force a decadent America to the negotiating table. Instead, it produced a unified nation demanding absolute victory. Japan had masterfully won the opening battles, but in doing so, had locked itself into a total war of attrition it could not possibly win. The industrial imbalance was staggering. In 1942 alone, the United States would build more aircraft than Japan produced during the entire war. Tokyo's goal was a limited war for a negotiated peace. The result was a total war for unconditional surrender. The strategic trap, set by Japan's own hands, was now sprung. The decisive battle to spring that trap was set for early June 1942. Admiral Yamamoto's plan for Midway was a masterpiece of complexity, a multi-stage operation designed to lure and annihilate America's remaining carriers, but it was based on a fatal assumption, that the Americans didn't know they were coming. They did. At a secret intelligence unit in Hawaii, Station Hypo, U.S. Navy cryptanalysts led by Commander Joseph Rochefort had broken the Japanese naval code, JN-25. They knew the target, codenamed AF, was Midway. Armed with this priceless intelligence, Admiral Chester Nimitz took a desperate gamble, positioning his only 3 carriers to ambush the Japanese fleet. On the morning of June 4th, the trap was sprung, but not on the Americans. As Japanese carriers rearmed for a second strike, their decks were a chaotic tangle of fuel hoses, bombs, and aircraft. At that exact moment, American dive bombers appeared overhead. In the space of 5 minutes, bombs struck the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The chain reactions were instantaneous. By the end of the day, a 4th carrier, Hiryu, was also burning. The core of Japan's naval air power, and with it, its entire offensive capability was gone. And so we return to Hideki Tojo's memo from December 8, 1941. His feeling of ease, his sense that a great anxiety had been lifted, was justified, but only in the narrowest possible sense. His planners had perfectly calculated the war's first act, but they had fundamentally misunderstood their opponent. The war was not truly lost on the burning carrier decks at Midway or in the jungles of Guadalcanal. It was lost months earlier, in the conference rooms of Tokyo. It was there that the entire strategy was built upon a single, fatal assumption, that a shocked America would negotiate for peace. They had planned a brilliant opening to a limited war, never imagining their enemy was now committed to a total war of annihilation. The attack was designed to secure an empire. It was a flawless military success, and in that very success, it became the single, irreversible act that ensured the empire's ultimate ruin.